Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Welcome back to the Hilltop. Welcome to Dedman College and Dallas Hall, and of course to the Center for Presidential History. My name is Jeffrey Engel, and I have the honor of directing that center, which means, of course, I have the honor of being your host for this evening as we continue our long series in presidential history and memoirs. Now, as always, our thanks to the provost, Paul Ludden, and his office for their continued support for everything that we do at the center. That makes everything that we do possible. And also thanks to our co-sponsor this evening, the George W. Bush Presidential Library, and to their director, Alan Lowe, for his continued partnership in so much of what we do together. Indeed, let me remind you that today is March 17th, which means it's not only St. Patrick's Day, it also marks precisely 21 days until baseball's opening day. Now 24, if you're waiting for the Rangers home opener. And for those who can't get your baseball fix fast enough, I encourage you to check out the Bush Library's new baseball exhibit, which is opening quite soon. It's well worth a look, and I understand, and I'm happy to make this commitment because he's not here, that the first 100 people in line every day get a free baseball signed by Alan Lowe. So there you go. And you can tell him I said that. Now, tonight we are here not so much to discuss our national pastime, but rather one of our nation's greatest tragedies. I speak, of course, of the Civil War as we complete our year-long look at that bloody conflict between North and South 150 years after its conclusion. As our speaker tonight will tell us, looking at the moment that the war ended, it was, of course, a moment full of tragedy, yes, but also a moment full of promise, of hope, and ultimately of what Abraham Lincoln so famously referred to as a new birth of freedom. Now let me tell you about our speaker this evening. You may recall several weeks back at a previous lecture that I made the point that there are, to my mind, three types of American historians working today. There are those who study the Vietnam War, those who study the Civil War, and everybody else. Now, we were glad enough and happy enough and lucky enough to have the person who I think is the leading Vietnam War scholar of our age, Fred Logevall, for his contribution to that statement. And tonight, we are very fortunate indeed to have someone who is no less well-established, no less prestigious, a woman who I think is clearly at the pinnacle of American Civil War scholarship. I speak, of course, of this person squirming next to me at this introduction, Professor Elizabeth Varon, the Langbourne M. Williams Professor of American History at the University of Virginia. With the degrees from Swarthmore College and Yale University, Professor Varon is a prize-winning scholar and teacher with publications ranging from the Civil War home front to the Civil War battlefield, from women's history to politics, from espionage to emancipation. Indeed, I think she is that rare historian, as you'll see this evening, who can relate both battlefield tactics and also the politics of hearth and home, having received awards and recognition from the Library of Virginia, the Museum of the Confederacy, the History Book Club, and this one's particularly cool, having authored a text that the Wall Street Journal named one of the top 5 books on the Civil War away from the battlefield. And considering there are, 29,000 books on the Civil War written every year, that's pretty good. Tonight, she will take us not only from the battlefield, but to the war's end and beyond, as she tells us about the Civil War's last great conflict, and I think, what we might say, one that continues to echo through our own time today. She will tell us about Lee, Grant, and Appomattox. And let me tell you, when you have the opportunity to get a copy of this before you go, this is a really good book. So if you'll join me in welcoming Professor Elizabeth Varon.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Jeff, so much for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure and honor to visit your magnificent campus. I've never been here before. I'm so impressed. It's just gorgeous, and I'm delighted to be here, and I thank Jeff and the Center for their hospitality. So Appomattox is our subject for today. Robert E. Lee's surrender to Grant, April 9, 1865, is for most Americans a familiar tableau. The two men met in the home, the parlor of Wilmer McLean, in the modest central Virginia hamlet of Appomattox Courthouse. Lee wore a fine dress uniform. He embodied the proud gentility of the South's planter elite. Grant was dressed in a mud-spattered uniform. He represented the hard-scrabble farmers and wage earners he had molded into a formidable fighting machine. The two men in the McLean parlor awkwardly exchanged some pleasantries about their service in the Mexican War, and then they agreed to terms, surrender terms, that effectively ended the Civil War. And in essence, those terms, Grant's terms, set free the conquered soldiers of the Army of Northern Virginia on their honor, the promise that they would never again take up arms against the United States. Grant's magnanimity in this hour, Lee's stoic resignation in defeat, not only reunited the North and South, but prepared the way for America's emergence as a world power. So this story I've just told you is an edifying story. It's the story of Appomattox as a gentleman's agreement, a moment at which these two iconic figures, for the sake of the country they both love, put their hatreds behind them and have a meeting of the minds. This image of Appomattox, this myth of Appomattox, casts the surrender as a moment of healing that transcended politics. But tonight, I'm going to tell you an altogether different Appomattox story and suggest that what happened on April 9, 1865 is even more significant and fascinating than we have realized. I'll propose that the surrender was an inherently political moment that would set the terms of an unfolding debate about the meaning of the war. Lee and Grant were both consummate leaders. They knew this. They knew the stakes were high, and that's why each man moved to stake out a position. Lee at Appomattox sought to turn military defeat into moral victory. In his view, the war, which was brought on by extremism, had cost America dearly, and the peace was an opportunity to obliterate the war's grievous effects, as Lee put it, and to regain, for the Republic, to regain what it had lost. And in Lee's mind, what it had lost was the civic virtue that Lee associated with the promising days of the early Republic before the Union's fall from grace. For Lee, the surrender was a negotiation in which he secured honorable terms for his blameless men. And the peace, in Lee's eyes, was contingent on the North's good behavior. The Union victory, in Lee's eyes, was one of might over right. Grant's position was diametrically opposed to Lee's. In Grant's view, the Federal Army's triumph flowed from the superior virtue of its cause. In Grant's view, the surrender was in no sense a negotiation. Grant's mercy was designed not to exonerate the Confederates, but to effect their repentance. He could be merciful, Grant believed, precisely because he had rendered Lee utterly powerless and his cause hopeless and discredited. For Grant, the Union victory was a victory of right over wrong, and the peace was contingent on the South's good behavior. These competing visions would exert a profound influence over post-war politics, but Grant and Lee didn't craft the surrender in isolation. As the Appomattox drama unfolded, their countrymen and women would crowd the scene and invest the surrender with their own agendas and aspirations and dreams. And those dreams included the dream of freedom itself. In the eyes of African-American soldiers in the Union Army and of former slaves, more than the Union was vindicated on that April day. Lee's surrender was, for African-Americans, a freedom day, the moment the promise of emancipation was finally fulfilled. So I'll propose tonight, in essence, that three distinct understandings of the surrender, of what an honorable peace would look like, took shape within the contending armies on April 9, 1865. Lee's view, with its nostalgia for the past, was utterly incompatible with the victors' interpretations, with their emphasis on change and progress. And I'll suggest, too, that debates over Appomattox and the surrender terms reveal not only the depth of bitterness between the victors and the vanquished, but also deep divisions within each society, divisions within the North and within the South. So we'll start with the Confederate vision of an honorable peace, with Lee's interpretation and that of the men in his inner circle. A little stage setting is in order. Grant breaks Lee's siege line running from Richmond to Petersburg in Virginia in early April. Lee's men pour out of the trenches at Richmond and Petersburg and head west, hoping to eventually turn south and link up with Joe Johnston's army in North Carolina. Grant, with Sheridan in the vanguard, pursues Lee, tries to catch him and cut him off. In the midst of this desperate chase across the Virginia countryside, on April 8, Lee pens a letter to Grant. This is part of a famous correspondence between the two men leading up to the surrender. And this Lee letter is a response to Grant's own letter, a letter in which Grant had suggested that the Confederate cause was hopeless and the time had come to capitulate. So in response to Grant's suggestion that he must surrender, Lee wrote, and I quote, "To be frank, I do not think the emergency has arisen to call for the surrender of this army. But as the restoration of peace should be the sole object of all, I desire to know whether your proposals would lead to that end. I cannot therefore meet you with the view to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia, but as far as your proposal may tend to the restoration of peace, I should be pleased to meet you." Now, in using this word restoration twice, Lee was beginning to elaborate his vision of an honorable peace. So what did he mean by restoration? This was a word that was a sort of key word in wartime politics. It was a favorite theme of the opposition party in the North, Lincoln's Republican Party, of course, the dominant party, the administration party. They faced off in the North against a Democratic Party, quite critical of Lincoln, and a wing of that Democratic Party, the so-called Peace Democrats, or Copperheads, really deplored Lincoln's conduct of the war, particularly emancipation, and sought to restore the Union to the way it was. This, in fact, was the Democrats' campaign slogan in the 1864 election as they tried to unseat Lincoln. Now, what does this have to do with Lee? Well, Lee had hoped, many Confederates had hoped, knowing perfectly well from the start that they were outnumbered by the North, that divisions within the North would spell the doom of the Lincoln administration, that these Democrats would be ascendant in the North, the Confederate battlefield victories would swell a chorus of Northern dissent and bring the Democrats to power and the North to the negotiating table. So restoration has those connotations. But Lee's own understanding of restoration was distinct. It was rooted in his family culture and that of his native Virginia. Like many other Virginians of his generation, Lee was steeped in nostalgia for the days of the early Republic, when other states almost took it for granted that Virginia would be their leader, when Virginians felt a proprietary pride in the Union, Virginia, the mother of all states, furnishing so many of the early presidents and so on. For Lee, an honorable peace would restore to the South the prosperity and influence he associated with these halcyon days, a kind of imagined past before the nation, as he saw it, had drifted away from the principles of the Virginia founders, before, as he saw it, abolitionists had imbued African Americans with false hopes of freedom and equality. Lee, at this moment in April of 1865, didn't seek the restoration of slavery. He knew that wasn't possible. But he certainly sought the preservation of the South's social hierarchy. From April 1865 on, restoration would be Lee's political keyword. This is a word we see crop up again and again and again in Lee's post-war correspondence. For example, 6 months after the surrender, Lee wrote to his friend Matthew Fontaine Maury the following lament about what had been and might again be. He wrote, quote, "As long as virtue was dominant in the Republic, so long was the happiness of the people secure. May an ever-merciful God save us from destruction and restore us to the bright hopes and prospects of the past." This was a fundamentally nostalgic view of the peace. Now, Lee's hopes for restoration were premised not only on nostalgia, but also on the case that his army was blameless. And he elaborated that case famously on April 10 in his farewell address. It was drafted by Lee's aide-de-camp Charles Marshall under Lee's guidance. And that farewell address, many of you will know it, began, quote, "After 4 years of arduous service, marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources." Confederate troops had remained steadfast to the last, Lee continued, and could draw satisfaction, even in this bitter hour, from the consciousness of duty faithfully performed. This farewell address immediately took on an iconic status. It had profound emotional resonance for Lee's men, his starving, exhausted troops. To these troops, the Yankee Army indeed seemed endless and encompassing. But Lee's farewell address had layers of meaning and deep tangled roots. For white Southerners, the reference to overwhelming numbers and resources was a sort of code. In the context of pro-slavery ideology and of the Confederate creed, numbers conjured up a Northern army of mercenaries and hirelings who had been seduced or coerced into service and had no real moral stake in the fight. This was a Southern secessionist image of the Northern army, a mercenary army. Resources conjured up images of Northern factories and cities in which an exploited underclass churned out the material of war at the behest of rapacious capitalists. Again, this is the Southern image of Northern society. Secessionists had seen the burgeoning wealth and industry and population of the North as an indictment of Northern society, of its social instability and its obsession with the bottom line. The farewell address's reference to the unsurpassed courage and fortitude of Confederate troops was part and parcel of that same indictment of the North. Again, in context, defenders of the Southern way of life in the antebellum period and during the secession crisis and throughout the war had made a staple of the claim that Southern men, accustomed to mastery and rural ways, were made of sterner stuff than Northern men, or wage slaves, as they were sometimes called by secessionists. Now, Lee was a sophisticated man. He was well aware of this ideological freight, and he knew what political work this farewell address would do, and indeed the farewell address was quite controversial, in implying that the Union troops had not been the equals of Confederate ones in the essential attributes of manhood. Lee's farewell address made a political statement by denying the legitimacy of the North's military victory, a victory of might over right. Confederates could deny the North the right to impose its political will on the South in the post-war period. At Appomattox, Lee moved on a second front to cast the surrender terms in the best possible light. Each of these surrendered Confederates was to be paroled, and Lee hoped that these paroles would confer on his men some immunity from reprisals at the hands of the victorious Federal Army. And so he requested of Grant at a second meeting the two men had on April 10, a brief meeting on horseback. He requested that each individual Confederate be issued a printed certificate signed by a Union officer as proof that that soldier came under the April 9 settlement, a parole certificate, a parole pass, so-called. Grant readily assented to Lee's request, and printing presses were set up at Appomattox that began churning out tens of thousands of these parole certificates. In keeping with the language of the surrender terms that the two men had agreed to, a parole pass vouched that if a surrendered Confederate soldier observed the laws in force where he resided, he was to, quote, remain undisturbed, unquote, remain undisturbed. Now, Union men imagined that these certificates would serve a purpose. They would remind the Confederates of the obligations attendant upon their status as paroled men. But as we'll see, Confederates emphasized the remain undisturbed clause in these parole passes. In their eyes, the paroles represented the promise that honorable men would not be treated dishonorably by the Yankees. In other words, in the Confederate interpretation of Appomattox, the surrender terms themselves imposed conditions on the North, and Lee and his lieutenants intended to hold Northerners to those conditions. A few weeks after Appomattox, Lee gave an interview, April 29, 1865, to a reporter with the Northern Herald. And in this interview, Lee warned that if, quote, arbitrary or vindictive or revengeful policies were adopted by the Republican administration, Southerners would consider the surrender terms breached and would renew the fight. 10 months later, testifying before a congressional committee investigating waves of anti-black violence in the South, Lee defended the lenient policies of President Andrew Johnson. These policies had brought ex-Confederates back to power. And Lee again cautioned, keep in mind here again, Lee is testifying before a congressional committee. He said to the members of this committee that the North must be restrained and cautious in its approach to reunion, for that was the best way, as Lee put it, for Northerners to regain the good opinion of the South. The main point here is this. Lee has a reputation in the modern day for having counseled resignation to defeat, for having said to Southerners, accept the situation. But for Confederates in the immediate post-war period, in those raw, uncertain days right after the surrender, Lee was not a symbol of submission. That's not how they saw him. They saw Lee as a symbol of measured defiance. Let me say a few words about soldiers and then civilians on the Confederate side. The emphasis in Lee's farewell address on Confederate righteousness blended seamlessly with the religious convictions of Confederate soldiers. Many of the Confederates at Appomattox, even in defeat, clung to the idea that God, however he might now chastise his chosen people, would someday deliver them. Such a conviction was the most comforting answer to a pervasive question: had all the suffering, all the sacrifice been in vain? In his April 9 diary entry, William Wyatt, a Confederate infantryman, plaintively asked, "Has God forsaken us?" Only to answer, quote, "I, for one, can't believe it. God, I verily believe, has humbled us to exalt us. I believe he will yet grant unto us deliverance and prosperity and honor." That night, Wyatt noted, the men in his regiment sung the hymn, "God moves in mysterious ways." In short, providential theology was flexible enough to accommodate defeat. God might still furnish victory, Confederates believed, in his appointed time. If we look at Confederate civilian reactions to the Appomattox news, we see a very similar set of themes. Civilians believed in Confederate righteousness, believed that Confederates had not relinquished a moral high ground at Appomattox. And indeed, Confederate civilians imagine the very surrender scene at the McLean House as an enactment of Lee's superiority to Grant. Lee's superiority to Grant. A revealing, if fanciful, account of the conference at the McLean House circulated through Confederate newspapers in late April of 1865. This wasn't an accurate account, but it was one that was widely circulated. And in this newspaper account, purporting to be a truthful one, Lee offers Grant his sword at Appomattox, and Grant refuses to take it. And according to the newspaper account, Grant turns to Lee and says, "General Lee, you keep that sword. You have won it by your gallantry. You have not been whipped, but overpowered, and I cannot receive it as a token of surrender from so brave a man." Of course, U.S. Grant never said any such thing to Robert E. Lee. But the report seemed credible to Confederates because it affirmed the might over right interpretation. A Confederate diarist named Emma Holmes wrote of the surrender scene that Union officers cheered for Lee as he left the McLean House, and that rank-and-file Yankees dared not utter, as she put it, a single insulting word to the defeated rebels. Why were the Yankees so reticent, even submissive, in victory? Holmes explained, quote, "They feared the lion even in chains," unquote. Lee the lion, commanding their deference and respect even in the moment of defeat. Now, in the year after the war, Confederates not only again and again invoked the overwhelming numbers interpretation of their defeat, they also invoked the Appomattox terms, particularly that "remain undisturbed" clause, as a shield against social change and as a weapon in a looming battle over black civil rights. Republican efforts to give the freed people a measure of equality and opportunity and protection were met by Confederate protests that such a radical agenda was a betrayal of the Appomattox terms. As one Virginia newspaper put it, "The prospect of black citizenship molests and disturbs us." In short, Confederates believed that Lee had drawn a line in the sand at Appomattox. The North Carolina poet Mary Bayard Clark put it most succinctly. Urging Southerners to model their behavior on that of Lee, she wrote in the summer of 1866 that Lee had, quote, "not stooped his grandly proud head one hair's breadth since he surrendered to Grant. Confederates would observe their parole terms," she said, "but more than this, an honorable enemy should not desire. It is idle to attempt to force them to say and feel they were wrong, for they were right." Now, it won't surprise you to learn that from the start, this view of things was resoundingly rejected by U.S. Grant and by his inner circle and by the vast majority of Union soldiers and civilians. It was precisely an admission of wrongdoing and a change of heart that Grant sought from his defeated foes. His mercy was designed not to exonerate the Confederates, but to effect their repentance. Grant believed he could be merciful because he had rendered Lee powerless. Again, for Grant, the Union victory, one of right over wrong. Now, Lee's rhetoric of restoration held no charm for Grant. Grant's eyes were fixed firmly on the future. Grant wouldn't countenance the rolling back of the transformations the war had wrought. The war had consolidated the power of the Republican Party, repudiated states' rights, emancipated the slaves, led to the enlistment of African American troops. These all, in Grant's mind, were salutary developments. Grant also rejected the idea that he had in any sense negotiated with Robert E. Lee at Appomattox. In Grant's view, Grant, had all the cards on April 9. There was no negotiation. Grant had issued the parole passes not to pay tribute to the Confederates and their courage, but to remind them of their status, the obligations attendant upon their status as paroled prisoners of war. Technically, that's what the Confederates were. Grant had released them, in other words, on the promise of their good behavior. Grant felt the meaning of his terms to be unmistakable. He would write in the spring of 1866, "I never claimed that the paroles gave these prisoners any political rights whatsoever. I thought that was a matter entirely with Congress over which I had no control." In other words, the fraught questions about the status of these surrendered Confederates, would these men again be permitted to vote, to hold office? Would they have property other than slave property restored to them? Grant knew that those were questions that politicians would have to answer. That was not his business to answer them. Surrender by parole was a military convention and rested on military calculations. Grant felt certain on April 9 that his lenience to Lee would help to effect the swift surrender of the remaining Confederate armies in the field, and that's indeed what happened. More than anything, the surrender in Grant's eyes was a vindication. That's Grant's key word, if you will. If restoration is Lee's, vindication is Grant's. The surrender vindicated the cause of union. The North's triumph vindicated the principle of rule by the majority, the founders' belief in a perpetual union, the capacity of citizen soldiers representing democracy to outfight the conscripts and dupes of an autocratic society. That's how Northerners saw the Confederate Army. The downfall of the Confederacy unburdened the South and the nation of slavery, an institution abhorrent to all civilized people not brought up under it, as Grant would put it. Grant did not believe Lee and his men to be blameless. He believed instead, and here I quote Grant, that for every sin there must be a chance at atonement. So the magnanimity is designed to effect that atonement. Now, Northerners rallied to Grant's interpretation just as Confederates did to Lee's. Union soldiers, for their part, if we look at their reactions to the surrender, we see that they attributed their victory to, as one infantryman put it, to superhuman effort on the part of the Army and to divine providence. "Thanks and praise to Almighty God for the great thing He has done for us in saving our country," wrote Major Holman Melker of the 20th Maine. Here he's expressing a widely shared conviction among Union troops that Providence had, in the end, rewarded the righteous, and that the Union side had won because that was the righteous side. For Union soldiers at Appomattox, there seemed to be something providential in the very physical setting of the surrender. Many soldiers noted with satisfaction that at the moment of final victory, they had Lee nearly surrounded. The defeated Confederates were massed on the low ground, laid in a valley, while the triumphant Union soldiers lined the hills of a sort of great natural amphitheater sweeping around the town of Appomattox. "A strange providence was surely at work, too," one Union chaplain wrote, "in the fact that the surrender terms were signed in the home of a man, Wilmer McLean, who had owned a house on the Manassas battlefield." So many of you are shaking your head in recognition. You know this story, the battlefield on which the first great Confederate victory was won. So Union soldiers' response, how wondrous the divine retribution. The most stirring sign of divine favor, Union soldiers thought, was the providential timing of the surrender on Palm Sunday. It was the universal expression among Union soldiers that the surrender was a blessed Sabbath's work. Union soldiers embraced Grant's policy of magnanimity in their hour of vindication, because they believed that in so thoroughly defeating the rebels, the Federal Army had meted out sufficient punishment to the South. The war was the South's punishment. And Union soldiers reckoned, too, that magnanimity was the best means to secure the redemption of the South, to change Southern hearts and minds. This very much in keeping with what I told you about Grant's attitude. So, for example, in a series of letters to his wife, Mary, an Army chaplain named Halleck Armstrong wrote, quote, the war had rendered the South a charnel house. The South had suffered enough, he wrote to his wife. All that was left was to forgive and forget. Armstrong shared a view that was very, very common among Northerners. Indeed, it was an article of faith in Lincoln's Republican Party. And this was the view that the mass of white Southerners, most white Southerners didn't own slaves. Republicans believed that the mass of white Southerners were under the thumb of the slaveholding elite, and that if these men could just be brought out from under that dominance, they might embrace free labor society. They believed that elite slaveholders like Lee and Jefferson Davis had led the common folk of the South astray, and that the Union's mission was to disenthrall these men. As this Army chaplain put it, if animated by a spirit of forgiveness, the victory could lift up the South's ignorant and degraded poor whites and open up before them a brighter future for themselves and their children. Disenthrall the men of the South who had been under the thumb of the planter elite. Now, most Northern civilians, too, favored magnanimity. Big argument in my book is that magnanimity is embraced across the political spectrum by Northerners and Southerners, but that they invest it with very different meanings. Among those Northerners who embraced magnanimity were abolitionists and radical Republicans, those Northerners who most wanted to see change in the South. It was charged in the immediate aftermath of the war by Confederates and by some of these Copperhead Democrats that radical Northerners, abolitionists, were intent on vengeance against the South. But the evidence suggests otherwise. In the eyes of abolitionists such as the influential editor Horace Greeley, magnanimity was a means to an end, a means to achieve a sacred purpose, to secure the ascent of the South to emancipation. Northerners, including many abolitionists, saw Grant's magnanimity as an emblem of their moral authority and even of their moral superiority. It proved, as Greeley would write, that a civilization based on free labor is of a higher and more humane type than one based on slavery. Greeley would also write, as he explained why he didn't want to see rebel leaders rounded up and jailed and punished. He also explained, as he put it, I want as many rebels as possible to live to see the South rejuvenated and transformed by the influence of free labor. In Greeley's eyes, what fitter fate for the likes of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee than to have to live in a brave new world, to bear witness to an unfolding social revolution. In essence, Northerners who embraced Grant's terms said to the South, we don't want to inflict further punishments, we want you to change. And Confederates responded that the demand for change was a form of punishment, that any demand for change was inherently punitive and therefore a breaking of the Appomattox Covenant. Now, interestingly, this contest over the surrender's meaning didn't simply pit the North against the South or even the Union against the Confederacy. It pitted those who wanted a thorough social transformation of the South against those who rejected such a transformation. So here we have a theme of divisions within each society. I've already alluded to the divisions in the North. They were partisan divisions between the Democrats and Republicans. Lincoln's opponents, the Democrats, Copperhead Democrats, were loath for Lincoln and the hated Republican Party to claim a mandate out of this victory, a political mandate. They didn't want the victory to be attributed to Lincoln's great leadership and to the Republican Party's excellent stewardship of the war. And so these Democrats rallied behind the Confederate interpretation of Appomattox. As one Democratic newspaper, the New York World, put it, in their valor, their endurance, and their martial skill, Southerners were equal to the North. The Confederacy was subdued by overwhelming numbers. Not by virtue, not by skill, not by Lincoln's leadership. But the South, too, was divided. White Southern Unionists, a beleaguered minority who had opposed the Confederacy during the war, they rallied behind Grant's interpretation and reveled in the fact that Grant had brought Lee to heel. To give a couple examples, in Union-occupied Little Rock, Arkansas, where a Unionist legislature was beginning to pursue Reconstruction under plans Lincoln had laid out, the announcement of Lee's surrender touched off days of hilarious rejoicing among Unionists in Little Rock. In Union-occupied Nashville, Tennessee, newly elected Governor William Brownlow, who had long been the spokesman for Southern Unionists in his state, marked the surrender by issuing a proclamation that designated May 4 as a day of thanksgiving prayer to the Almighty God. Brownlow, in his capacity as the editor of the Knoxville Whig and Rebel Ventilator, a Unionist newspaper, rejoiced that Lee, the greatest army and general of the so-called Confederacy, had been defeated and scattered and made to surrender to Grant upon his own terms. Southern Unionists rejoice at Grant's victory. But things take an interesting turn. In the year after the surrender, this dominant Union interpretation, with its emphasis on the vindication of the Union cause, comes to incorporate an argument about the lost promise of Appomattox, the betrayal of the true spirit of Grant's magnanimity. And for Grant and his followers and Republicans in the North, the arch betrayer of the Appomattox terms was Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor. I already alluded to this complicated set of developments during Johnsonian Reconstruction. Johnson comes to power. He pardons former rebels by the thousands. He permits them to be restored to their political rights, rights to vote and hold office. State governments are turned over to former Confederates. They enact a series of laws called Black Codes designed to enforce white supremacy in a world without slavery. And Grant and Republicans look on these developments with some disappointment and then horror. It seems the fruits of the Union victory are slipping away. So Grant is radicalized by these developments, by this recalcitrance on the part of former Confederates. And Grant will write that, confronted with the foolhardiness of the far too lenient Andrew Johnson, and, as Grant put it, the blindness of the Southern people to their own interest, Grant would adapt. I gradually worked up to the point where I favored immediate enfranchisement for blacks, Grant would explain in his memoir. He had not been in favor of black suffrage during the war or even at its end, but he came to see it as essential, the only way, in Grant's eyes, to make sure that the Republican Party got to dictate the terms of Reconstruction, the only way to dispel the ex-Confederates' pretension that, as Grant put it, they would be able to control the nation and were entitled to do so. Grant felt, again, the Union victory was slipping away. And perhaps the most interesting single piece of evidence on this theme, and to me the most surprising thing I found in this research, was that Grant was deeply disappointed by Lee's behavior in the year after the war, deeply disappointed at Lee's refusal to give the victors their due. In May of 1866, now the surrender's anniversary has just passed, 1 year anniversary has just passed, Grant gives a newspaper interview with a Northern reporter. And in this newspaper interview, Grant takes Lee to task. He says to the reporter that Lee was, quote, behaving badly, unquote, setting an example of forced acquiescence so grudging and pernicious in its effects as to be hardly realized. An example of forced acquiescence, grudging and pernicious in its effects. This is Grant's characterization of Lee's behavior. Grant resented Lee for denigrating the Union victory as a mere show of force and for encouraging Confederates to resist change in the name of restoration. And this image of a Grant who's angry at Lee's comportment hardly accords with our image of a gentleman's agreement between the two men and of a meeting of the minds at Appomattox. The true story is far more complicated. Grant, here I'll allude to presidential politics, Grant learned in this year after the war that he would need to enter the political arena to finish the work he began on April 9, 1865. And Grant, of course, would succeed Andrew Johnson as president in 1868. I'll turn now to my third interpretive mode, to liberation. And this is the material here that's the most unfamiliar, I think, for most people. No Americans hoped more keenly or asserted more fervently that the surrender marked a new era than African Americans. And I'll turn now to their experiences. For them, the Union victory vindicated the cause of black freedom. Interestingly, at Appomattox, African Americans were both liberators and the liberated. I described to you this setting, Lee's men pouring out of the trenches and heading west, trying to outrun Grant's army catching up with them, setting a trap on April 9 at Appomattox Courthouse, the Confederates trying to break free of that trap. Lee's army will find on the morning of April 9 that its escape route is blocked by black soldiers in blue, 6 regiments of the United States colored troops, with one other waiting in the wings. And when these regiments heard confirmation of Lee's capitulation, when flags of truce started to go up, the black troops' exultation knew no bounds. They shouted, danced, and sang, and embraced each other with exuberant joy, as a white Union private observed. These regiments at Appomattox represent, if you will, a microcosm of black life in America at this time. The regiments included Southern men, former slaves who had fled slavery and gone to Union lines to join the Union Army. These men, many of them were trained at Kentucky's Camp Nelson, a training ground for black troops in the Union-occupied South. They included also northern free blacks, men who had never been slaves, who trained at places like Philadelphia's Camp William Penn. These Appomattox regiments included men who would become great leaders in the post-war period. Luckily for me, they included in their ranks the man who was the preeminent African-American historian of the late 19th century, was there in the ranks at Appomattox fighting for the Union. They included a Baptist editor named William J. Simmons, who would be the journalistic mentor to the anti-lynching crusader Ida Wells. They included a man named George Edmondson, who was a descendant of the Hemmings family of Monticello, Jefferson's family. Fascinating group of people. Now, for all of these soldiers, regardless of their backgrounds, their presence on the battlefield was itself the culmination of a long struggle. We know this story from the excellent movie Glory. African Americans had volunteered to fight in the Federal Army and had been turned away initially. Racism was a profound problem in the North as well as in the South, and the Union government had deemed these men unfit for service. But they had pressed to prove their mettle. They had finally gotten a chance. The regiments at Appomattox had seen some considerable action. African American soldiers were keenly aware, however, even after giving all this proof of their courage, that their march toward equality could be turned back so long as there were powerful Confederate armies in the field. As we also learned from Glory, the Confederate government's official policy was to regard African American Union soldiers as, in effect, rebellious slaves, liable to be enslaved or executed if captured. Black soldiers were aware, too, that many white Northerners viewed their enlistment as a kind of social experiment, testing the capacity of blacks for citizenship, and that many of those white Northerners hoped and expected that the experiment would fail in the end. Now, not surprisingly, given this context, black soldiers quickly seized on the role of the United States colored troops in this Appomattox campaign as a vindication. As William McCausland of the 29th Regiment USCT put it in a May 1865 letter, quote, "We, the colored soldiers, have fairly won our rights by loyalty and bravery." Many of these men's white officers and comrades in arms shared the conviction that the USCT's role in the last battle had been decisive. Luman Tenney in Sheridan's cavalry wrote a letter to his mother and sisters about the fighting on the morning of the 9th. He described the scene this way, quote, "The morning of the 9th came, the Union cavalry was being pushed back rapidly towards Appomattox Station. The boys were falling, scores of them. Why was it? With victory so near. When over the hill a dark column was espied coming down the road in close column at quick time. What a relief from the awful suspense. What cared we for the color or race of those men so long as they brought relief to us? We saw courage and determination in their coal black faces." Moreover, black troops understood themselves to be an army of liberation whose defeat of Lee and the Confederate Army was a nail in the coffin of slavery itself. And here again was a very surprising discovery for me. I found abundant evidence that slaves saw April 9 as a freedom day, a hallmark in the sort of road to emancipation. And for many of these slaves who testify about this, April 9, not January 1, 1863, you'll recall January 1, 1863, when Lincoln issued his famous Emancipation Proclamation. April 9 was the real day of emancipation. Why? Well, in their reckoning, as long as Confederates controlled the South, as long as the most powerful and prestigious Southern Confederate institution, Lee's army, was still in the field, there was no real freedom. You needed Confederate defeat before freedom would become tangible. Virginia slaves were the first to hear the tidings of the surrender and to fathom the significance of the event. None other than Booker T. Washington, in his classic autobiography, Up from Slavery, remembers how when the war closed, the day of freedom came to southwestern Virginia. A United States officer belatedly read the Emancipation Proclamation. First, these slaves had heard of it on that day in April 9, announcing that this long-awaited moment of deliverance had come. We have another fascinating group of sources for accessing African-American interpretations, and those are interviews conducted in the 20th century, in the 1930s, by a New Deal agency called the Works Progress Administration, or WPA for short. The WPA conducted interviews with elderly African Americans who had been alive before emancipation in the days of slavery. Many of them were quite elderly by the time these interviews were conducted. They remembered childhoods in slavery. And if we read these reminiscences, and there are 2,000 some of these, it's a remarkable source. They're all available on the Library of Congress website for us to consult. We see these reminiscences echo Washington's observation. For example, one of those interviewed, Fanny Berry, remembered that slaves in Pamplin, Virginia, had burst into spontaneous song when they learned that Lee, his escape route blocked by the USCT, had raised the white flag. For at that moment, she told her interviewer, we knew we were free. For some former slaves, the date of Lee's surrender structured their very sense of time and of history. History came into focus at that moment. Eliza Washington told her interviewer, quote, "The first thing I remember was living with my mother about 6 miles from Scotts Crossing in Arkansas about the year 1866. I know it was 1866 because it was the year after the surrender, and we all knew the surrender was in 1865. This moment looms large in black folklore. And indeed, Appomattox will persist as an enduring presence on the commemorative calendar of freed slaves. They began to hold Surrender Day annual festivities, April 9, marking that anniversary. This happens first as early as 1866 in certain Virginia counties. And I found evidence of April 9 celebrations in African American communities in Philadelphia and Chicago, usually in churches, into the 20th century. Now, African American soldiers' pivotal role as agents of liberation would long remain points of pride within black communities. And the fact that black soldiers had helped to defeat Lee gave additional symbolic meaning to the surrender. Lee and his army, in the eyes of African Americans, USCT veterans, typified the slaveholding elite, its pretense of racial superiority. According to Thomas Morris Chester, a black newspaper correspondent embedded with the Union Army of the James, the Confederate capitulation was especially sweet because it was a rebuke to the FFVs, or First Families of Virginia, whom he wryly dubbed, after the surrender, the fleet-footed Virginians. In short, men such as George Washington Williams and Thomas Morris Chester made and then sustained a bold claim that in helping to defeat Lee's army, African American troops had dealt a death blow to all that army stood for, including slavery. And the most interesting thing here is that African American soldiers' interpretation of the surrender, and even of the terms, attempted to inscribe a civil rights message into Grant's magnanimity. African Americans emphasized the promise of Appomattox. They depicted the freed people and USCT soldiers in particular as agents of national healing. So this historian, George Washington Williams, who was an Appomattox vet, would write in an 1888 history of the role of black troops in the war the following. He would say that black soldiers had treated the vanquished Confederates with, quote, quiet dignity and Christian humility. After the Confederate army had been paroled, he wrote, the Negro troops cheerfully and cordially divided their rations with the late enemy and welcomed them at their campfires on the march back to Petersburg. The sweet gospel of forgiveness was expressed in the black soldiers' intercourse with ex-rebel soldiers who freely mingled with the conquerors. It was a spectacle of magnanimity, Williams wrote, never before witnessed. Now, here Williams is doing something very important and interesting. He's trying to counter a very long-standing charge, a charge that went back to the 18th century, a charge that was leveled by those who opposed abolition, anti-abolitionists, against those who wanted to end slavery, a charge leveled by Northern and Southern anti-abolitionists. And it was a charge that you couldn't have emancipation, because if you had emancipation, you would have social chaos and retribution and violence and race war and vengeance and so on. A dystopian image of emancipation. And for decades, African American abolitionists and their white allies had been saying, no, if you have emancipation, you'll have the only real chance at harmony and a reconciliation. Slavery is the problem, not abolition. Here, Williams is entering the fray of that argument, saying black magnanimity at Appomattox is an exercise of moral authority, a conscious effort, as purposeful as Grant's own act of clemency to Lee, a conscious effort to break a cycle of violence, to reset the clock and start over on grounds of harmony and reconciliation. But could the cycle be broken? African Americans who invoked Appomattox as a signifier of hope were fighting a rearguard action against a determined foe. In the decade after the war, those opposed to change in the South and in the North began to elaborate the lost cause tradition, a mythology that romanticized slavery in the Old South and the Confederacy, that demonized Republican Reconstruction as corrupt and punitive, and that sought to justify vigilante violence by groups like the Klan as a legitimate means to restore the old order. Now, needless to say, For champions of this lost cause mythology, there were no black heroes in the Appomattox story. There was no liberation from tyranny. There was no promise of interracial reconciliation. As I suggested earlier, unreconstructed rebels interpreted that key line in Grant's surrender terms, the promise that paroled Confederate soldiers would remain undisturbed by the U.S. authorities, as a promise that although slavery was defunct, the racial caste system would remain undisturbed. In the view of men like Confederate General John Brown Gordon, radical Republicans broke that promise when they accorded civil rights to ex-slaves. As Gordon put it in testimony before a congressional committee in 1871, Grant and the Union Army had been deferential to the Confederates at Appomattox, promising, here I quote Gordon, "We should not be disturbed so long as we obeyed the laws." But radicals had broken that promise, Gordon continued, by telling Confederates, quote, "Your former slaves are better fitted to administer the laws than you are," unquote. His message was clear. In his view, the only way to restore the peace was to leave the white South alone to manage its own affairs. So in conclusion, for African Americans no less than for whites, Appomattox came to represent a lost promise, in this case, the betrayal of the promise of freedom, a betrayal both by those whites who rejected black citizenship outright and by those who gave up the fight for it. However compelling and comforting the image of the surrender as a gentleman's agreement may be, it doesn't begin to capture this complex legacy of Appomattox. Deep into the 19th century, Appomattox was at the heart of the politics of race and reunion. Thank you. Hey, thank you. I'd be delighted to take questions if folks have them. Please don't hesitate.
Actually, we are recording as always, so if you wouldn't mind waiting till one of the mics reaches you before asking the question, that would be ideal.
Surely there are some questions. Anyone? Yes, sir. Did you have anyone? Oh, okay. There, it looks like it's on its way to you.
With
I think it's on.
with the assassination of Lincoln, when the next army surrendered, and terms similar to Grant's were granted, they were then rejected. I'd like to have your comments on that.
Yeah, sure. So you're referring there to the surrender of Joe Johnston's army, and Sherman gives Johnston terms that are even more lenient than Grant's, that seem to go to a place that Grant knew he was not supposed to go. Grant was not supposed to address the questions of political immunities, rights being restored, when and how the states would be reintegrated into the Union. Sherman's terms seemed to gesture at and grant renewed citizenship to Confederates and went beyond the spirit and letter of Grant's terms. And so Sherman was ordered to bring his terms into line with Grant's, and Grant is sent south to kind of clean up the mess, as it were. Now, it's an interesting moment, as you alluded to. This is after Lincoln's assassination. And Andy Johnson, as vice president, comes to power, and people aren't sure what to expect of Andy Johnson. Andy Johnson is a Southern Unionist. He had been a senator from Tennessee when the war broke out, the only Southern senator to stay with the Union rather than side with the Confederacy. Lincoln had rewarded him for his loyalty by making him military governor of Tennessee when the Union had occupied large swaths of that state. Johnson had ruled Tennessee with a pretty heavy hand. He'd been quite loyal to the Lincoln administration and to the Republicans. Johnson, though he had been a slaveholder, owned a handful of slaves, even came to embrace emancipation as a military necessity, a way to punish the Confederates and rob them of resources. So Johnson became a kind of emblem, the preeminent emblem of Southern Unionism, this thing that Northerners really hoped, wanted to will into existence, if you will. So election of 1864 comes along. We should take a moment to note that it's a remarkable tribute to our country that we had an election in the middle of a war. And there were some people who said to Lincoln, well, maybe we should cancel the election. You know, we're in the middle of a civil war. And Lincoln said, you cancel the election, and the other side has won a moral victory, right? The point here is to preserve representative government. So Lincoln is, this is going to be a long-winded answer, but you ask a professor a question, this is what you're going to get. It was a great question. Johnson is added to Lincoln's ticket. Lincoln does away with his former vice presidential partner Hannibal Hamlin and adds Johnson to the ticket in 1864, thinking that Johnson can represent a kind of big tent approach that the Republican Party is going to take at this moment. The Republicans briefly in 1864 rename themselves the National Union Party. They want to get war Democrats, those who wanted to see the war through to victory, in their fold, and they believed Johnson, who had been a Jacksonian Democrat, also represented those people. So Johnson seems to be a good, loyal lieutenant for Lincoln. He becomes president, and it's very unclear what he's going to do. As he rose up in his political career, he'd really talked tough against the planter elite, being a yeoman of very, very humble roots, the most humble roots of any American president. And so many felt that he was going to be very tough on that Southern elite, the likes of Davis and Lee. But then, again, as in a story I alluded to, he proved to be very lenient to that former elite. And the moment you're talking about, the controversy over Sherman's terms to Johnston is still a moment of uncertainty where it's unclear which way Andy Johnson is going to lean. It's at the end of May that Andy Johnson promulgates his own Reconstruction plan, which, again, allows for the restoration of political rights to Confederates if they essentially take an oath of allegiance to the U.S. government. And that permits a pretty rapid resurgence of the power of that old elite. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned leniency a number of times in terms of the what happened at Appomattox. Would you comment on President Lincoln's meeting with Grant, Sherman, and Farragut at City Point, Virginia, where Lincoln said to them, gave them general instruction to, quote, let them up easy in terms of the surrender terms.
Yeah.
And he even went so far as to say when Sherman pressed him that if they had the chance to capture Jefferson Davis, Lincoln said something like, well, just let him go as long as I don't know about it. So would you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So that's a great question. So Lincoln famously says in his second inaugural address, at a moment when he might have been justified in a certain amount of chest thumping, he says, malice towards an uncharity for all, a soft peace is what Lincoln wants. He wants a soft peace because for him, from the start, the goal of this war was to make the Union whole again. Lincoln, again, like many Republicans, sees Southerners as errant brethren who have to be brought back into the fold. That's the aim and purpose of the war. So the peace must be lenient to change hearts and minds and to effect that. As you have said, Grant had met with Lincoln twice. Grant had marching orders. He knew exactly what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to give military terms that were in the spirit of the malice towards non-charity towards all political model that Lincoln had articulated at that moment. So Grant's terms didn't address these questions of, for example, the voting rights or so on of the Confederates, but he hoped that those civil authorities would be lenient, as Lincoln had intended. Now, it's an irresistible question. What would have happened if Lincoln had lived and Johnson hadn't taken over? You allude to part of the answer. Lincoln had a choice of rounding up the leading Confederates, people like Jefferson Davis, and clapping them into prison, and worse, maybe executing some. This is what had happened in civil wars in world history before ours. Lincoln, as you said, let it be known that it would suit him perfectly well if Jeffy Davis would quietly slip into Latin America, never to be seen or heard from again, right? Because then he wouldn't have to make a martyr of him, and he wouldn't have to set what he felt would be a bad example. I think if Lincoln had lived, he surely would have handled things better than Johnson. Lincoln had this incredible way of explaining his political goals to people in ways that they found compelling. And Johnson didn't have that gift. But Lincoln would have encountered the same obstacle that Johnson did, and that is that finding that the Southern rank and file and the Southern masses didn't want to be disenthralled from their leaders. They remained deeply devoted to those leaders, and this kind of fantasy of the Republicans quickly winning hearts and minds, foundered on the shoals of that devotion of Confederates to their leaders and to the society they'd lost. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm curious, in your research on the complexity of Appomattox and the politics, what role do you think West Point played in all of this? Because so many of the generals were classmates and friends, and and Appomattox was a reunion of a lot of friends.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and the knowledge of that, I think, has been one of the things that has tempted us to sentimentalize the moment. On the other hand, there's something very important there. Grant, there's no question that Grant had a soldier's respect for his fellow soldiers, including Lee and the Confederates, and you know, many of them, as you said, in some ways there was a lot of West Point reunions there at Appomattox. Grant was much more resentful of the Copperheads, the anti-war Northerners, than he was of the Confederates. That's where his real bitterness and angst was directed. What Grant hoped to tap some of that camaraderie that you've alluded to, and his model was Longstreet. I mean, Grant wanted Lee to behave as Longstreet would. Longstreet, you know, Lee's famous war horse, a hero of many Confederate battles. Longstreet, after the war, not immediately, but by 1867, Longstreet's position was a victory for the Union and for the Republican administration, a military victory, is a victory for your principles. And we have now to yield and accept the righteousness of your principles. Longstreet will become a Republican. And a pre-existing friendship with Grant, to get back to your question, will deepen for that reason. Longstreet will lead African-American troops against a Klan-like group of white supremacists in New Orleans in a battle during Reconstruction. A remarkable sort of turnaround. And he would suffer consequences for this. He would be cast out of the Confederate pantheon. He's not the only example of a Confederate who embraced the Republican Party after the war. William Mahone, John Mosby, a few others did. But Grant was hoping that there would be more Longstreets. And I think he was trying to tap those old friendships, and he thought that they would assert themselves in this moment. But again, I think he failed to recognize the power of Southern nationalism and the hold it had on these men. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
One of the really riveting moments of your book, it seems to me, is when Lee is discussing the terms of surrender, such as they are, with his own generals, having his own council of war, and several of them, of course, say it's time to give up the ghost, but several of them say we should take to the hills.
Yeah.
And we should, you know, basically be bandits, be guerrillas, we'll take off.
Yeah.
A, what planning had been done on the Union side for such a contingency?
Yeah.
And B, how would that have changed the narrative of the war if some of his troops had actually done something which was against Lee's leadership?
Yeah, so very interestingly, famously, Lee and his lieutenants discussed the possibility of guerrilla warfare, melting into the mountains and continuing to fight it out in that way. And Lee rejects that possibility, to his great credit. He says, I'm too old for bushwhacking, which, you know, he was 58, he was too old for bushwhacking, and he'd suffered a lot during the war. He'd had all kinds of health problems that had plagued him. He was in bad shape at this point. I'm too old for bushwhacking. He thought it dishonorable. But there's another part of this, and that is that it wasn't the first time guerrilla warfare had come up. The Confederates had tried guerrilla warfare, and it hadn't worked. The Union had developed, you know, counterinsurgency measures that were really quite effective, that they'd used in Northern Virginia and in Tennessee and all over. So Lee, in a sense, was making a noble choice, but he also knew it wouldn't work and hadn't worked. Any other questions?
Stanton obviously had pretty strong opinions on his not having any surrender terms at all, and not reinstating the state governments. Can you talk a little bit about how successful he was on inserting his opinions on Lincoln as opposed to Johnson?
Yeah, so Stanton is definitely has his doubts about a malice towards none, charity towards all attitude, and believes he has to kind of safeguard against excessive leniency. Stanton, the radicals believe that he's their friend and that he's going to try to press hard for change. And there's no question that he had Lincoln's ear in a way that he wouldn't have Johnson's ear. Johnson and Stanton, you know, I mean, there'd be a very dramatic battle between the two men during Reconstruction, as Johnson tries to get rid of. Essentially what happens, to make a long story short, is the executive branch and Congress go to war during presidential Reconstruction, as Congress has one vision of what needs to happen, and Johnson has another. And Stanton is a prize in that war. The Union Army is a prize in that war. Grant is a prize in that war. Once Johnson realizes that Stanton will not do his bidding, he tries to kick him out of office, and Congress tries to protect him. And Johnson has a similar falling out with Grant. Johnson believes that Grant might be his ally initially, but Johnson alienates Grant, and it must be said that Johnson alienates men like Stanton and Grant not only by his policies but also by his behavior. Johnson gets out of the gate very, very poorly. He appears to be visibly drunk at the swearing-in ceremony for his vice presidency. And he just is a man who has trouble keeping his temper. So he goes out on the stump and he gives speeches that, as his critics would describe it, seem very much more befitting a kind of common brawler or scold than a president. You know, he doesn't comport himself in a presidential way, and this just adds to his problems. So Reconstruction is terribly complicated, but one kind of handy way of thinking about this period is that at the end of the war, you have a Republican Congress. Most of the people in it are moderate. They want to do whatever seems loyal to Lincoln's wishes. They're very hesitant about things like black suffrage. Those things seem too radical to most Republicans. But Johnson's behavior is so erratic that he pushes those moderates into the harms of the more radical Republicans. And this is a process we see unfold.
Well, I actually had not known that Johnson was drunk when he was sworn in. But it suggests to me...
He claims that he had been medicating himself because he was unwell.
See, I was going to suggest that if he was drunk, that means that he had a true appreciation for the role of the vice president.
Touche.
Yes. We do have books for purchase, of course, and signing and discussion. And if you all join me in thanking Professor Varon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.